The first frost of autumn had settled over the Montana Territory when Thomas Hale, a rancher who had lived alone for nearly 10 years, stood outside the small depot at Copper Ridge. He wasn't there to meet a shipment. He wasn't there to meet kin. He was there to meet the woman he had agreed to marry, through nothing more than 6 months of letters. When the train finally hissed to a stop, the platform went quiet. A young woman stepped down, dressed plainer than her posture, though her bearing gave her away at once. Thomas stared, then looked down at the photograph in his hand, then back up at her. "There's been some mistake," he said. She tilted her head, a small, careful smile. "No mistake, Mr. Hale. I'm Charlotte Ashford. You wrote to me every month. I answered everyone. You're far too fine to be my wife," he said. Before he could stop himself, something flickered behind her eyes, not offense. Something closer to old, tired sadness. "Fine doesn't feed cattle," she said. "I came to work same as you did." Thomas had no answer ready for that. He picked up her trunk instead, and found it heavier than he expected, and said nothing about that either. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon creaking over frozen ruts, the breath of the horses hanging white in the morning air. He apologized for the wagon, for the thin blanket over her knees, for the cabin she hadn't seen yet. "It isn't much," he admitted. Charlotte looked out over the pale gold grass rolling toward the mountains. "I didn't come looking for much," she said. "I came looking for quiet." That word settled into him deeper than he expected. "You'll get plenty of that out here," he said. "Some days too much of it." "I've had worse company than quiet," she said, and didn't explain further. And he didn't ask. They rode a long stretch without talking after that, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. That surprised him more than anything else that day. When they reached the cabin, she stepped inside before he could carry her trunk. No carpets, no glass lamps, just a stone hearth, a table he'd built himself, and a single shelf of books worn soft at the corners. She ran her hand along the shelf. "This is a good house," she said. "Most folks say it's a bare one." "Most folks don't know the difference between bare and honest," she said. For the first time in 10 years, the cabin didn't feel like it was waiting for someone to leave. Before sunrise the next morning, Thomas rose to check the herd, quiet so as not to wake her. He found her in the barn already, sleeves rolled, coaxing a limping calf toe stand. "You ought to be resting," he said. "I didn't come here to rest," she said, not looking up. "I came here to be useful." He stood in the doorway a long moment, watching her hands work, sure and unhurried, like she'd done this kind of thing before, somewhere, sometime. "Where'd you learn to handle a calf like that?" he asked. "My father kept horses," she said. "Before he lost most everything. Animals don't care what a person's lost. They only care what's in front of them right now." He hadn't known until then how tired he'd been of doing everything alone. Over the following weeks, the ranch began to change in small ways. A row of turnips went into the garden. The windows got their first proper scrubbing in years. The smell of baking bread reached clear out to the barn some mornings. Thomas noticed things he hadn't noticed himself needing. He noticed the way Charlotte mended his shirts without being asked. Small neat stitches at the elbow where the cloth had worn thin. He noticed she never once complained about the cold water, or the long walk to the well, or the nights the wind found every gap in the cabin walls. He started splitting extra kindling each evening, more than the house needed, just so there'd be a full stack waiting for her by the stove come morning. She never mentioned it. He never mentioned it either, but she started leaving a cup of coffee, poured and waiting for him at the same hour each day, and that went unmentioned too. One evening, he came in from mending fence to find she'd fixed the hinge on the cabinet door that had been crooked since before his mother passed. "You didn't need to bother with that," he said. "Wasn't a bother," she said. "Just a hinge." He looked at it a long moment. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have sat in his chest the way it did. One thing puzzled him, though every Sunday after chores, Charlotte walked alone up the ridge behind the house, and skated near an hour before coming back down. She never spoke of it, and something in her face told him not to ask, so he didn't. Not yet. He watched her go from the porch some Sundays, a small shape climbing the brown grass slope, and he told himself it wasn't his business, even as some part of him wanted badly to follow. By the 4th week, Thomas found himself doing things he hadn't done in years. He mended the porch step that had sagged since his father's time, though nobody had asked him to. He rode the extra 3 miles into town for flour, instead of settling for the coarser feed store grade. Because he'd noticed she used real flour for the biscuits she made on Sundays, and hadn't complained once about the poor grade he kept. He started coming in from the fields earlier than he needed to, just to sit at the table while she cooked, saying little, content just to watch her hands move. Charlotte noticed all of it. She never said so plainly. But she began humming while she worked, soft and unconscious, a thing Thomas came to listen for, without quite admitting to himself that he was listening. One evening, a fine black carriage came up the ranch road, drawn by 2 matched horses that had clearly never pulled a plow. The man who stepped down wore a tailored coat and city boots that hadn't touched mud in years. His name was Randall Vance, and he owned half the cattle contracts in 3 counties. He looked Charlotte over the way Eamon looks over a horse he intends to buy. "Miss Ashford," he said, "a woman like you wasn't raised for a place like this. You were raised for supper parties and a house with a 2nd floor." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He said nothing, because some small old part of him believed the man might be right. Charlotte stepped up beside him and took his rough hand plainly, in front of Vance and everybody. "When I lived in a house with a 2nd floor," she said, "men admired my dress. Out here, one man asked after my day before he asked after supper. I know which I'd rather have." Vance's smile thinned. "You're young yet," he said. "Winters out here have a way of wearing thin on that kind of sentiment." "Then I'll wear thin alongside a decent man," Charlotte said, "rather than stay warm beside an indecent tone." Vance's smile thinned further. He tipped his hat, climbed back into his carriage, and didn't return. Thomas watched the carriage shrink down the road and understood something plainly for the first time. Comfort and love were not the same current, and only one of them had ever carried him anywhere worth going. That night at supper, he finally found the nerve to ask what he'd been holding back for weeks. "That man wasn't wrong that you could have more," Thomas said. "Why answer my letters at all? Out of every man who must have written to you?" Charlotte set down her fork. "Because your letters never once tried to sell me on this ranch," she said. "Every other man wrote about what he owned. You wrote about what you missed. The smell of rain coming in over the ridge. Your mother's garden. Your brother's laugh before he passed. A man who misses things that plainly is a man who knows how to love something. I wanted to be one of the things he loved." Thomas didn't have words ready for that either. He simply reached across the table and took her hand, and for once, didn't let it go first. That Sunday, Thomas followed her up the ridge at a distance, staying behind a stand of birch. She knelt beside a small wooden cross half sunk in the grass, and laid down a handful of late wildflowers. "I kept my word, Papa," she said quietly. "I found a good man, plain but good. You always said plain was worth more than polished. I didn't believe you until now." Thomas stepped back before she could see him, and walked down the ridge slower than he'd walked up it, his chest tight with something he didn't have a name for. That evening, he told her he'd followed her, and was sorry for it. "I kept thinking," he admitted, "that sooner or later you'd wake up and realize you married beneath what you deserved." Charlotte took both his hands. "My father built a fine life and lost every bit of it to bad partners and worse luck," she said. "I watched wealth come and go inside of 2 years. I learned early that it isn't worth trusting. I didn't marry the best-off man who wrote to me. There were 2 others, better off by far. I married the honest one." For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Thomas stopped seeing himself through his own doubts, and started seeing himself the way she did. Winter came on hard that year. The wind found every gap in the cabin walls Thomas had meant to fix for years and never gotten to. He fixed them now, one by one, in the evenings, while Charlotte sat close by the fire, mending, humming that same soft tune. There were hard nights. A calf lost to the cold despite everything they tried. A supply run to town cut short by a storm that came up faster than either of them expected, leaving them stranded 2 days at a neighbor's place, sharing one small room with strangers, and somehow laughing about it after, once they were finally home and warm. "Some folks would call that a disaster of a trip," Charlotte said, peeling off her frozen gloves by the fire. "Some folks haven't spent 10 winters alone out here," Thomas said. To meet felt near close to a holiday. Charlotte laughed at that, properly, for the first time since she'd arrived, and the sound of it filled the cabin in a way nothing else had. Spring came up green through the melting snow, and Thomas spent long days mending what the cold had broken. One evening he came home to find Thayard full of neighbors, the porch freshly painted, new glass set in the windows. "You helped near every family on this stretch of road at one time or another," an old neighbor told him. Figured it was past time somebody returned the favor. Thomas stood in his own yard, surrounded by people he'd spent 10 years keeping at arm's length, suddenly unsure what to do with all the goodwill aimed his way. Charlotte came up beside him, flour still on her hands from helping serve the pies. "You built this without meaning to," she said quietly. "All those years you thought you were only surviving out here. Turns out you were being watched and admired the whole while." "Didn't feel like admiration most days," Thomas said. "Felt like just getting by." "Sometimes that's the same thing, to folks watching from outside it," she said. In the middle of the gathering, a carriage pulled up, finer even than Vance's had been, and a silver-haired woman stepped down and called Charlotte's name. This was Eleanor Ashford, Charlotte's aunt, who had spent the better part of a year tracking down where her niece had gone. She looked over the modest ranch with open disappointment. "Charlotte, come home," she said. "Your father's estate is settled. You'd never want for anything again." The yard went quiet. Even Thomas looked away, believing he had no right to ask her to stay against an offer like that. "You could have a proper house," Eleanor pressed. "A proper name back in society. This," she gestured at the yard, the barn, the modest cabin, "this was never meant to be the whole of your life, child." Charlotte walked slowly toward the carriage, past the polished wood and the waiting driver, and every soul in that yard held its breath. She ran her hand along the carriagedure, the way she'd once run her hand along the bookshelf that first night. Then she turned back, crossed the grass, and put her hand in Thomas's. "My home was never a matter of address," she said. "It's wherever this man is standing." Eleanor studied them both a long moment, her sharp composure faltering just slightly. "Your mother said something near identical. The year she married your father," Eleanor said slowly, "before he had 2 acres to his name. I thought her a fool for it then. And now?" Charlotte asked. Eleanor looked at Thomas, at the paint-stained hands, the mended porch. The neighbors gathered thick around him, and then opened a small case she'd carried the whole way. Inside sat a plain gold ring that had belonged to Charlotte's mother. "My husband always said land was wealth," Eleanor said quietly. "My sister always said it was whoever stayed. I'm only now old enough talk now she was right." She placed the ring in Charlotte's palm, embraced her, and rode away without another word about the estate. That night on the porch, Thomas turned the ring over in his fingers. "I still can't rightly say why you chose this," he admitted. Charlotte leaned her head against his shoulder. "Because you never once tried to impress me," she said. "You only ever showed me exactly who you were, even when you thought that wasn't much." "It wasn't most days. It was everything most days," she said. "You just weren't the one who got to decide that." For the first time in years, Thomas stopped asking whether he was enough. A month on, a hard spring storm broke over the valley, swelling the creek past its banks, and scattering stock for 2 miles in every direction. Thomas rode out into it before first light. Charlotte pressed his father-sold gloves into his hands at the door. "Come back to me," she said. "Always will," he said, and meant it. The storm was worse than either of them led on to the other. Rain came sideways, hard enough to sting. Thomas lost sight of the ridge more than once, and had to trust the horse's instinct over his own eyes. By the time the storm broke, he'd brought in 11 head of his own, and turned back twice more for a neighboring family stranded past the washed-out bridge, carrying a young boy across the swollen creek on the back of his saddle, while the boy's mother waited behind, holding tight to the horse's flank. He came home well past dark, soaked through, hands raw from the cold, and found Charlotte on the porch with a lantern, exactly where he'd left her that morning, as though she hadn't moved the whole day. She didn't scold him for the risk he'd taken. She only wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and said, "I knew you'd come back. I just needed to see it happen, before I believed it all the way through." "Why wouldn't I come back?" "Because good things leaving me isn't new," she said quietly. "It's just new you not leaving." Thomas held her a long moment on that porch, rain still dripping off thieves, and said nothing, because for once nothing needed saying. The valley took him in that spring like he'd done something worth remembering, and for once, he let himself believe it. At the spring gathering that followed, The town's reverend handed him a small carved marker, not for strength, he said, but for the kind of character a town could build itself around. Thomas looked past the applause to Charlotte, who wasn't clapping, just watching him with a look he'd come to know well. That night he told her something he'd never told another soul. When I wrote those letters, he said, I wasn't looking for sweetness or romance. I was tired plain through, of eating alone and working alone, and getting old with nobody to hand any of it to. I figured whoever answered would be desperate, same as me. Never unks thought it'd be somebody like you. And I answered, Charlotte said, because I wasn't hunting a perfect man. I was hunting an honest one. I'd had my fill of polished men what turned out hollow underneath. I wanted plain, because plain doesn't know how to lie near as well. Neither of them said much else that night. They didn't need to. Summer came on full and green, and with it came harder work than either of them had bargained for. A fever that swept through half the herd. Nights spent in the barn nursing sick animals back from the edge. Charlotte right alongside him in the lamplight more nights than not. You don't have to be out here every night, Thomas told her, more than once. I know, she said, every time. I'm out here anyway. They lost 3 head that summer. They saved 11. Thomas had never in 10 years had anyone to share either the losses or the saving with, and he found, to his quiet surprise, that both went down easier shared than they ever had alone. By the time the fever passed, the two of them had gone from strangers bound by paper and 6 months of letters to something neither had a TD word for yet, though both of them felt its shape plainly enough. A year on, the Hale Ranch looked little like the bare place Charlotte had first walked into. Wildflowers grew thick along Theffen's line. A second horse stood in the pasture that hadn't been there before. Somewhere down by the creek, 2 children's voices, a neighbor's boys, carried up with Charlotte Slaughter chasing after them. The bookshelf had grown too. 4 new volumes added since spring. One of them a battered old book on animal husbandry that Thomas had taken to reading some evenings, slow and careful, sounding out the harder words under his breath, while Charlotte pretended not to notice and smiled into her sewing anyway. Standing on the same porch where he once doubted every part of himself, Thomas looked over at his wife. I was wrong that first day at the depot, he said. I told you that you were too fine for me. Charlotte laughed and slid her hand into his. You weren't wrong that I was fine, she said. You were only wrong about the rest of it. We were exactly matched. It just took you a season to see it. Feels like longer than a season, looking back. Feels like exactly the right amount of time. Looking forward, she said. As the sun dropped behind the farrage, Thomas understood, plain and whole, that the best thing he'd ever built on that land wasn't the fences or the herd. It was the two of them, standing there together, with no ridge left between them at all. Not the one behind the house, and not the on it that had once stood, invisible but real, between a lonely man's doubt and a tired woman's hope. Some Sundays they still climbed Therridge together now, and stood a while by the small wooden cross, and said nothing much at all. Because by then, there wasn't any need to explain what the visit meant. They both understood it the same way. And some evenings, long after Thacker's were done, and the lamp turned low, Thomas would look across Theodable at the woman he'd once told, plainly and foolishly, that she was far too fine for him, and he would think, every time, that he had never in his life been more grateful to be wrong about something.